Hi everyone, I'm Diego. I'm a PhD student at Sphere Ultrafast Photonics in collaboration with the University of Salamanca within the framework of the QU-ATTO network. And today I would like to talk to you about the temporal characterization of fused cycle laser pulses using the dispersion scan approach. The temporal characterization of laser pulses is an important part of a research project involving lasers because we need to know if our pulses are suitable for the experiment we want to carry out, and if this is not the case, a temporal characterization can help us to optimize them. So, as we know, a laser pulse is a physics electromagnetic phenomenon that can be described in the spectral domain or in the temporal domain, both connected by the Fourier transform. This connection imposes a restriction in the duration of a laser pulse, which is related to the spectral bandwidth by the time bandwidth product. This product says that the temporal duration multiplied by the spectral bandwidth is always greater than or equal to a constant k, whose value depends on the energy distribution profile of the pulse. That can be, for example, a Gaussian envelope, a hyperbolic second. So, according to the time bandwidth product, a long pulse in time means that we have a narrow spectral bandwidth. And a short pulse in time means that we have a broad spectral bandwidth. So the spectral bandwidth limits how short a pulse can be in time. However, getting a short pulse is not as simple as generating a super wide spectrum. We also need all the spectral components to be in phase. This means that all the frequencies that are part of the spectrum must appear at the same time, and this is what we call the spectral delay. If all the spectral components are in phase, then we can get a short pulse in time, but if they are out of phase, then we get a chirped pulse, in which the spectral components appear at different delays, causing a temporal broadening. This chirp is caused by the dispersion of the optical media, and all of them, except the vacuum, are dispersive. So short pulses are highly susceptible to temporal broadening because they always travel through optical media. And there are two types of dispersion. We have the normal dispersion, when the low frequencies travel faster than the high frequencies, or in other words, the reds travel faster than the blues, and this is what usually happens. And we also have the anomalous dispersion, when the high frequencies travel faster than the low frequencies, or the blues travel faster than the reds. So when a pulse travels through a material, its spectral phase will be changed. And we can express that change with this equation. This phase added by the material can be expanded as a Taylor series, as we can see in this picture. And this Taylor series allows us to see the different effects that a laser pulse can undergo when traveling through a dispersive material. So the first order term is called the group delay, or GD, and it controls the retardation of the pulse in time in relation to a pulse traveling in vacuum. It doesn't change the pulse envelope, it just delays the pulse in time as a whole. The second order term is what we call the group delay dispersion, or GDD. For a pulse that is initially compressed in time, this term will broaden the pulse, hence reducing its peak power. The GD design imposes the kind of dispersion. If it is positive, then we have normal dispersion. This is the most common situation. And if it is negative, we have anomalous dispersion. The third order term is what we call the third order dispersion. This term just induces asymmetries in the pulse, generating satellite pulses that can be pre-pulses or post-pulses, depending on the sign of the TOD. And it also reduces the laser pulse peak power. So these are the main effects that a pulse can suffer from when traveling through a dispersive material. So let's see now what happens to two different pulses when they pass through 1 millimeter of fused silica. These pulses are centered at 800 nanometers. So in the first case, the pulse with 30 femtoseconds duration, as we can see, it remains almost the same after passing through the material. But if we let pass through 1 millimeter of fused silica a 3 femtosecond pulse, we can see that the peak power has decreased a lot, while the time duration has increased. So short pulses are so hard to keep short because we cannot avoid using materials in our experiment. So we must be able to control the dispersion carefully to keep them as short as possible. To control the dispersion, there are already different schemes which we call compression schemes. All of them try to introduce negative GDD because, as we have said, the materials usually introduce normal dispersion. Here we are going to summarize the most useful schemes. The first one is the Prim's compressor. In this case, we take advantage of the frequency-dependent dispersion of the prims to rearrange the spectral components of a laser pulse and synchronize them in time. This is done by precisely adjusting the angles and distance between the prims, making the fast frequencies or the blues travel more optical path inside the prims than the slow frequencies or the rares, which compensates for the initial GDD of the pulse. In this case, 4 prims are used in a symmetric setup to also compensate for the angular and spatial chirp that the pulse has suffered after passing through the first 2 prims. The second scheme is the grating compressor, which take advantage of the different diffraction angles for the different frequencies that form the pulse spectrum. The principle is the same as in the Prim's compressor, making the blues travel more optical path than the reds, and then recombine the pulse spatially. Gratings can, however, introduce much more dispersion than Prims. The third scheme is also based on the grating principle. In this case, we create an image of one grating on the other using 2 positive lenses. By moving the second grating, or the grating on the right in this picture, we can adjust the amount of dispersion introduced, which can be positive, negative, or 0. The fourth scheme uses acoustoptic waves to create a filter with 2 possible axes for light travel. By adjusting the acoustic wave, we can make the blues to travel along the slow axis and the reds to travel along the fast axis, which can compensate for the initial chirp of the pulse. And the fifth scheme is the chirp mirror compressor. A chirp mirror is a multi-layer mirror which is designed to let the blues penetrate and be reflected deeper within the mirror than the red frequencies. This allows us to synchronize them in time. So all of these different compression schemes have different advantages and disadvantages, but the most used for few cycle pulses is the chirp mirror scheme because of their high throughput, broadband compatibility, and also the engineered spectral phase with minimal residual higher order. So, as we can see, we can use different strategies to compress our laser pulses, but how do we know if they are compressed? For this, we need a temporal characterization technique to know it, and one of them not only measures the pulse in time, but also compresses it. It is the dispersion scan or D-scan technique already developed more than a decade ago. So, the D-scan is composed of 2 primary modules, a variable compressor to modify the phase of the pulse, and the measuring part where a nonlinear signal is generated, filtered, and measured by a spectrometer. A nonlinear signal, usually the second harmonic generation, is generated because it depends on the phase of the fundamental pulse, and we want to know the shape of this phase to know if our pulse is compressed. So, here we can see a picture of the most used setup. The variable compressor in this case is composed of 2 glass wedges and a pair of complementary chirp mirrors. We call it variable because one of the wedges can be displaced, changing the amount of positive dispersion induced to the pulse. The chirp mirrors introduce negative dispersion to the pulse, so they compensate for the dispersion introduced by the wedges. As we can see, this method requires no pulse splitting, no interferometric precision, and no time delays, like other temporal characterization techniques. But how is a D-scan measurement performed? Just in a simple way, what we have to do is to align our laser pulse with the D-scan setup. Then we start moving the variable compressor, and for a set of positions, we generate and acquire the nonlinear spectrum. With all these spectra, we can build a plot called the D-scan trace, which is basically a map of the nonlinear response as a function of the wavelength and the compressor dispersion, which usually is represented by the relative glass insertion. Usually in these graphs, the zero insertion just represents the position where the pulse is best compressed. So the dscan trace provides instant visual feedback on the compression quality. So let's see what kind of information we can instantly get from a dscan trace by varying some parameters. So first, suppose that we have a flat spectral phase and we vary the pulse spectral bandwidth. So long pulses in time, that means that we have a narrow bandwidth, become limited along the wavelength axis and spread out in the dispersion axis, while short pulses become limited in the dispersion axis and spread out in the wavelength axis. So we can see that a short pulse has a trace that is long, thin, and flat. If we modify the group delay dispersion of the pulse, the dscan trace will shift up in the dispersion axis for negative GDD or down for positive GDD. To understand this, just suppose that the GDD of the pulse is negative, so the trace is up. To compensate for it perfectly, we need a bigger glass insertion in the wedges, and this insertion will shift down the trace. If we modify the third order dispersion, then the trace is tilted according to the sign of the TOD. This means that different frequencies in the pulse are compensated by different glass insertions because there is a frequency-dependent chip. If the phase has a varying fourth order dispersion, then the trace acquires a parabolic behavior. If the phase is wavy, then the trace becomes wavy too. If, for example, the spectrum has a whole of varying amplitude, the trace remains continuous, but the pulse shape is encoded in the trace. And if we have a double pulse structure with varying delay, then the trace becomes more modulated as the delay increases. So, as we can see, the dscan trace encodes a lot of information. But how do we retrieve this information from the dscan trace and reconstruct the fundamental pulse? We can do it following this method, which aims at solving the so-called general phase retrieval problem and in a more comprehensive way than other characterization techniques. The workflow consists in 5 basic steps. So first we have to measure the dscan trace in the lab. Then, in a computer program, we define an initial guess field, and a spectrum plus a spectral phase, and we use it to simulate the dscan trace with the lab conditions. Then we run n times a specialized algorithm which is tasked with minimizing the error between the measure and the simulated traces by adjusting the initial guess field. After running the algorithm, we can retrieve the spectrum and the spectral phase that minimize the error. This final field should be almost identical to the actual fundamental laser field. And finally, using this field, we can reconstruct the fundamental pulse in the time domain. So, the first step is simple. We need just to set up a lab experiment and measure the dscan trace, which is strongly correlated with the spectrum and the phase of the pulse that originated. In the second step, we can be more creative and use different approximations for the initial spectrum and phase. For simplicity, we can take a super Gaussian and a flat phase. We can also measure the fundamental spectrum in the lab and use it as the initial guess with a flat phase, for example. Then, with this field, what we have to do is to simulate the dscan trace, creating a matrix in which each row represents the nonlinear spectrum for a given glass insertion. Then the optimization algorithm adjusts the initial guess field until the error between the measure and the simulated trace is minimized. Once the algorithm has minimized the error, we get the spectrum and the phase, which is known for every position of the compressor. With the dispersion scan, we also obtain other key parameters, such as the spectral response function of the nonlinear process and the spectrometer, without prior knowledge of these quantities. And finally, by applying an inverse Fourier transform to the output field, we can reconstruct the pulse in the time domain for every point of the compressor. This retrieval determines the optimum compressor position, namely the position where the pulse has the best quality and the flatness phase possible. So, As you can see, all of this requires a lot of time and a high level of complexity, but once implemented, this technique can be very simple and fast. In fact, the company Sphere Ultrafast Photonics, for which I'm working now, it specializes in this technique, and its flagship product is the D-scan device. It is compact, fast, and robust. The only thing you need to do is to align your laser with it and use the software developed by Sphere to reconstruct your pulse. It can take less than 1 minute to do it. But not only that, it is also flexible because it can measure short and long pulses, and reliable because the wavelengths responsible for the nonlinear process create redundancy in the trace that guarantees robust and accurate retrievals even in the presence of noise. So, going back to the beginning of this presentation, why should we bother characterizing our laser pulses? Because it can help us to fix two of the most usual problems that we can encounter in the lab. Why is our experiment not working, and what is wrong with our laser? And now we know that the D-scan technique is here to help us. Thank you so much for your attention.